Are we live? Are we good? Okay, we're good. All right. Welcome back. Welcome back. Today is going to be a fun one because we need to talk about the power of sunlight. But before we get to that, which is something I think we'll talk about more in more detail next week, is we're going to talk about how did we even end up in a place where most folks are scared of the sun, and how did this become dogma that is now perpetuated um, by the modern medical health profession, if you will. Because believe it or not that long ago, and I'm talking less than 100 years ago, they were using sunlight for therapies to heal things, which is a complete 180 from where we are right now. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's just jump right into it. So, we got to talk a little bit about skin cancer first, what it is, some of the details with that. So, roughly 6 million people per year. And America, by the way, I should keep that using American statistics. Roughly 6 million people per year are treated conventionally for skin cancers. Cost Americans almost $9 billion annually for these treatments. So it is, needless to say, big business. However, when you go back and look in history, we never had people, getting skin cancers. This is really a phenomenon that's taken place from like the 1980s onward. And if you go back, 100 or so years, this really was not the case. It just wasn't happening. It has ballooned, especially in the last 30 years. So we need to ask ourselves why. And more specifically, we need to ask ourselves, why is this happening to human beings and not other species that are, outside, which is all of them. And we're going to get into that a little bit as to why. Like, did the sun, the UV, the ultraviolet light suddenly become ultraviolent, but only violent towards humans and no other species? Why is that the case? That seems to be pretty strange, if you ask me. So we're going to get into it a little bit. And no, before we jump into it, it doesn't matter, how fair skinned you are or if you have blue eyes. Anyone can become more tolerant of the sun when you start fixing your terrain. And it starts by realizing that the modern human being, the modern day human being in a modern Western society, is actually the sickest species on the planet. So when you are the most acidic, when you are the most toxic that of any species that is in existence, and more than that, we are the sickest species of human beings that have ever existed. And we now even see with life expectancy that these kids, for the first time in history, are not expected to outlive their parents for the first time ever. So, we really have to start asking questions like, did the sun just become extra mean? Or is it the standard Western diet that they're trying to push, a 90+% ultra processed food diet, claiming that that's going to be healthy? Or hormone imbalances from endocrine disruptors? Or a lack of sun exposure? Yes, you heard that correctly. Or no exercise routine? Or excesses of physical, chemical, emotional stresses or toxic chemicals? Because if your body is in an acidic, toxic state, you are leaving yourself more prone to injury. And that's not just from allegedly the sun. That could be from anything. And that shouldn't be a surprise that 6 in 10 Americans have a chronic disease, that over 50% of kids have a chronic disease. These are not, I have an MTHFR gene mutation. That's not what's happening here. It is large scale chronic degeneration of a species. And until we take responsibility for doing this to ourselves and stopping this nonsense of, it's this thing that we can't see that's causing the problem and there's nothing you can do about it, we're going to continue to go down this hole. Now, what's important to understand is how did we get here? Now, before this modern craze, I need to, when I was doing some research into this actually blew my mind. So there was a practitioner in 1903 named Niels Ryberg Finsen, Finsen, who actually won a Nobel Prize in 1903 for using sunlight to treat smallpox and tuberculosis. You read that? This is 120 years, literally 120 years ago. Won a Nobel Prize for treating people with sunlight. I need to let that sink in and take a pause for a second, because if you were to tell most people this, you will have a completely glazed over look, like, no way, that's impossible. Like, how can you actually heal someone with sunlight? That is how far we've done a 180. Now, there was another doctor, Dr. Auguste Rollier, I believe is how you say his last name, Rollier. So I'm going to say Rollier. He used sunlight, which he called heliotherapy, to have a number of benefits from skin disorders, believe it or not: acne, psoriasis, burns, eczema, seasonal affective disorder, helped with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, helped manage blood sugar, increase white blood cell counts if they were low, improve cardiac output, improve blood oxygen carrying capacity, reducing bacteria counts by as much as 50% from infections, um, improving the blood of cancer patients, like the blood quality, improving kidney function. Uh, it, it it's for all from just using sunlight exposure. And this guy got so into it. He was a Swiss doctor. He's in Switzerland. He opened up 36 clinics throughout Switzerland. And I actually found some pictures. Unfortunately, I can't share them on here, but you could see he actually put these beds outside of his clinics so that his patients can get sun while they were in the bed. Or if they were injured and they were trying to recover from an injury, he would put them literally out in the sun to get sunlight to help with the healing process. And he's built all of these 5,000 feet above sea level. So he had 36 clinics that he opened up 5,000 feet above sea level. And the reason he opened them up basically a mile high is because for every 1,000 feet above sea level, UV radiation increases 4%. So if you get to 5,000 feet, 4 times 5 is 20%. So 20% more, 20% more intense UV radiation at 5,000 foot elevation, mile in the air. He wanted more UV light exposure, not less, to enhance the healing potential of his patients. Again, I'm just going to pause for a second there. Because what are you told today? You're told that UV light's going to kill you. You're going to, it causes all these skin problems. You're going to get damaged, et cetera, et cetera. No, they actually found that there was healing potential in UV light. Now, he did recommend, which is what I tell people who, yell at me in the comments for this, is he actually recommended if these people were inside for long periods of time, you would have to slowly build up your exposure times. So it's not like you just go out like a lot of people do here in the Northeast. You have a cold summer or cold winter. Memorial Day comes around. You've been out inside for 5-6 months, probably haven't gone out too much, and then you're at the beach for 6 hours or 8 hours, and you wonder why I got a sunburn. It's because you have no adaptation to your natural environment because you spent your entire last 6 months indoors. So you have to work your way up. And again, these guys in the first half of the 20th century were doing this. And one of them won a Nobel Prize for treating people with sunlight. Now, Vincent, I believe, passed away in the early 1900s. Rollier passed away in 1954. And this was like kind of an unfortunate time because at that time, basically like all his research and everything that he did basically died kind of with him. So and by the way, between them two, between Rollier and Vincent, they found that this is crazy. They were able to use UV light to treat over 165 diagnoses, according to them. And I was just going over a few of them earlier. over 165 between the thousands of patients that they saw just treating using UV light and diet. But then again, that's another thing too, but we're going to keep that part out. But because we're focusing on one thing today. Now, 1954, what came around right after that? Around the 1960s, what we know, at least here in America, is this was like the beginning of the boom of the advertising agencies, right? So this is where, pharmaceutical industries really started digging into the advertising aspects, because America is one of two countries on the planet that allows for pharmaceutical advertisements. If you live in America, you will know that 50+% probably of your advertisements you see on TV are for drugs. And it's very funny when you talk to people who come visit America who aren't from here. And if they watch TV, they're like, wow, that I've never, like, it's jarring very quickly. If you ever talk to someone who's not an American and watches TV in America, that's a very jarring thing for most people. So, in the 60s, it was essentially laying the groundwork for that type of advertising onslaught that we would see, in the back half of the 20th century and obviously into the 21st century, where it is now a seemingly unstoppable beast that that advertising has been in that space. So once we get to the 1980s, now again, like, we're going more chemical. Basically, after World War II, we had a lot of petroleum type leftover material, and a lot of this went into. This is how we went into a boom, with pesticides, but also with rubber products, with plastics. They needed to use all these petroleum-based products that were now not necessarily being used for the war machine. So all these things end up being repurposed into things that would ultimately start seeping into the supply. So, for example, when we were talking about grounding, this is where rubber-based shoes, rubber-soled shoes started coming in. And now most people aren't grounded most of the day, or if at all during the day. So because we have rubberized sole sneakers, shoes, what have you. We're not in grass. We're not in sand. We don't have leather-bound shoes. That's a big thing. So between like the 60s and the 80s, we basically took like a 180-degree turn in our view on the sun. And by the time we got to the 1980s, it was the typical, let's create the problem and then share the solution and come up with the solution. So, it's, the UV, the ozone layer is thinning, UV light's getting in. We have the miracle cure. We call it sunscreen. And through the magic of advertising, this essentially permeated the popular narrative, the popular culture, without any real scientific backing. It was mostly a marketing thing. And we're going to get into why. So it's going to take a lot of people to realize that this history aspect of it, because in order to change course, we need to understand what skin cancer is there proof with the ozone narrative, and kind of where we go from here. I mean, we do know, and I'll be putting this in my newsletter tomorrow. So if you're not signed up for my newsletter, you could sign up using the link in my bio. I come out with them every week. This is going to be part 1 on sunlight, and I have all the graphs and figures and stuff that I'm going to share there. It'll be written out. It'll be very nice. But what we see is actually those who avoid the sun or get the least amount of sunlight have a greater risk of all-cause mortality, literally all causes of death. You have a higher risk of dying when you are not in the sun. The more time you spend in the sun, the better chance you have of survival. There are multiple studies that show this. And we see it, as we'll get into a little later. Folks who live closer to the equator have less incidences of skin care. This is widely known, even in the conventional medical community. Yet again, we play this game. So let's get into like skin cancer for a second. And before we jump into skin cancer, we need to talk about cancer in general. And we love categorizing things here in the traditional conventional medicine kind of space, where we want to know the specifics for everything. It's not just cancer, it's breast cancer, it's prostate cancer, it's lung cancer, it's colon cancer, it's skin cancer. But the truth is, they're actually all more or less the same thing. They're just named different depending on where they show up. But it's all the same thing. So what cancer cells are simply cells that are damaged by in an acidic environment, in their own acidic waste. Cancer, you can't spread cancer to someone else. You can't, give it to someone, if you will. I know there's a big craze nowadays where it's like, oh, well, mom or dad had breast cancer or prostate cancer. So, I guess, that I just got dealt a crap hand of cards. No, because if you look at cancer rates, including skin cancer rates, even back as recent as 100 years ago, they are absolutely nothing like what they are now. So we have to realize that we are the most toxic, the most acidic generation of humans, generally speaking. And until we actually address the underlying causes of inflammation, of toxicity, we're not going to get to the root cause of the problem, because cells become stronger or weaker depending on our genetics. Our genetics really are just the strengths and weaknesses that are passed on by our parents. And those are due, by the way, to their actions. Also, your lifestyle, and also what you think and feel. And by lifestyle, what you eat, what you drink, how you breathe, and what you put on your skin. Why? Because your skin is basically your second mouth. If you put it on your skin, it's going to get absorbed. So, and we have to understand now that in these modern times, 1 in 2 people are projected to get cancer at some point in their life. That is an insane statistic. It's insane. And we have to realize that, like, this is largely self-inflicted. It almost completely is self-inflicted. So, it's the pesticide and herbicide use in the gardens and the food supply and the genetic modifications, antibiotics, certain medications, smoking, occupational hazards, hormones like xenoestrogens in the food supply, radiation and non-native EMF exposure, toxins in the air, soil, and water. We know things like glyphosate and antibiotics end up in water, in tap water. Cleaning products, triahalomethanes, chlorinated hydrocarbons, flame retardants in, your cushions, your mattresses, phthalates, parabens, talc. All of these things are toxins that did not exist 100 years ago, or in a much smaller amount than they do right now. So before we start getting to, oh, the sun is the problem right now, even though it's never been for any other species or at any other time in human history, we need to start looking at the environment that we're putting ourselves in and address that first before we start blaming things we have no control over. So with that out of the way, let's get to skin cancer. So skin cancer generally comes in 3 main flavors. So what happens is you have these melanocytes, which, as you might guess by the name, are responsible for creating melanin. They're usually kind of deeper in the layers of the skin, but they essentially create melanin and then send it out to the other skin cells, which then you see as, your skin tone, right? So that's essentially what melanocytes are. They end up getting their function ends up being altered. Now, generally speaking, there's 3 major types of skin cancer. We have basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and malignant melanoma. Now, the most commons are the basal cell and the squamous cell. They are not as deadly. Malignant melanoma is, generally speaking, the more deadly one. Usually, like, if you look at them, so, and this is just, for information, basal cells tend to be a little bit brighter in color. They almost have like a pearly kind of sheen to them. Squamous cells are usually a little bit darker. They might be a little bit more irregular as far as their borders, whereas basal cells tend to be the borders are very defined. And melanomas are usually very dark, almost even black. They might bleed, they might ulcerate, and the borders are kind of asymmetrical. They're kind of all over the place. So those are usually the differences between the 3, if you want to look. And you could certainly like Google a picture of what does basal cell look like versus melanoma, just in case, if it's something that you're worried about, or like those what they look like. Now again, the conventional, kind of route, and again, there is no doubt that skin cancers right now are much more common, as we're going to talk about, than they've ever been. But it's not because the sun just woke up one day in the 1980s and decided to, get pissed at just human beings and no other animals. So the sun's influence on human skin is based on essentially three primary factors. And it is the sun itself, which produces obviously UV radiation, UV light, the earth and the atmosphere, which the UV rays have to travel through or it gets obstructed by. And then we have the human being itself, which, the light can penetrate to. So we need to like ask ourselves some questions here. Like, has the sun changed over human history? No, not really. As the atmosphere, and we're going to get into this, not really. But has human behavior and activity changed? We just went over that. Yes, that is what is changing. It is the behavior and activity of human beings that is changing, not the sun, not the atmosphere. So number 3 on the list is the thing that's causing the most issues. Now we have to realize, like, since the start of the new millennium, so since 2000, at least 1 million Americans per year have been diagnosed with some form of skin cancer every year. In 1980, that number was 8,000 people over the previous 8 years. So about 1,000 people per year leading up to 1980. So what is going on? Because we need to talk about the main usually argument that folks will make for, like, the UV radiation stronger now, the ozone layer is depleting, all this. So, usually, like, this is where it comes in, is the medical community kind of comes in. There's a changing environment, specifically in the ozone layer, that's becoming more dangerous to humans. It's letting more UV light in. And again, like, if we just like use common sense and, went outside and looked around, there is no other species that is getting skin cancers except human beings, and interestingly enough, domesticated animals, but not wild ones. So if this were true, if this theory was true, you would see that all species there should be a rise in cancers. So, it's not, it wouldn't be just human beings. That wouldn't make much sense. We have this dangerous misconception. A lot of folks in the scientific community have this misconception that human beings are somehow the exception to the laws of nature. We need to like take a step back and look. If this is true, it should be happening to all species that live on the surface. That seems fair. But it's not. So we need to understand like kind of what's going on with this. So it turns out they tried to prove this, back in the 70s, kind of going into this, right into the 80s. And they took measurements of UV radiation in the US from over an 11-year span from 1974 to 1985. And they assumed UV radiation was increasing because the ozone layer was thinning. That was the theory, the hypothesis. And what they found was actually the opposite. They found that on average, the UV radiation was decreasing annually from 1974 to 1985 and actually continued to decrease. So even though, again, these claims that the ozone layer is thinning, more UV light's getting through, based on these measurements, it was actually the opposite. UV radiation was decreasing. So if you take that into account, you would think if UV radiation was causing cancer, like that is the mainstream narrative, you would think 100 years ago, more people would have had skin cancer, when we obviously know that's not true. It's not even, it's, as we just talked about, like clearly not true. That now more people are getting skin cancer now than ever before. So it can't be due to more UV light coming in, because as I just mentioned, there's not more UV radiation coming through. So that theory kind of goes out the window. Now, because of this fear with the ozone layer, it actually led to this to the Vienna Convention in 1985, and the goal, part of it was because they tried, despite this, like it led to this Vienna Convention, and part of what they tried to do, excuse me, with this is try to figure out why. What can we do about this at a policy level, a political level, to stop this? So they asked these researchers to put together some scenarios and make some projections. And if any of you have seen kind of what's been going on the last few years, we know how accurate certain projections can be, right? But basically, they ran three scenarios. So they ran one where they made no changes to anything. They made one where essentially 50% of the ozone depleting agents would be, the production of them would be stopped. And then the other one, they stopped the production of 21 known ozone depleting chemicals, and they assumed that these policies would be taken up worldwide. And based on these assumptions, they guessed by the year 2100, so 70 years from now, or almost 80 years from now, skin cancer rates would quadruple by 2100. Now, mind you, this is 1985. There would only be a doubling in the second scenario, where 50%. And if they actually went through with what they mentioned, there would only be a 10% increase in skin cancer rates by the year 2045. Now, obviously, we know this isn't true because, as I mentioned, the skin cancer rates have exploded way beyond that. Exploded. Not even close to these projections. So, again, and they assume, so this was all under the assumption that UV light was going to be the cause of it. And we have exploded well past these numbers, well before 100 years. And in fact, we're talking 1985. So that is what, almost 40 years ago. Not even halfway there. And we have blown past all of these projections. So it can't be, this ozone layer thinning is causing more UV light and the UV light is causing cancer. So it all begs the question, like, if UV radiation is actually decreasing, like, what are the other factors that must be playing a role? And we went over some of them already. So we have to get into UV light a little bit. And Michael mentioned, like, UV light, we're not getting some abnormally large amount of UV light coming into the earth now compared to what was happening. That is not the case. Despite that, we now live in a world where most people think that, it's going to kill you. Despite that, 100 years ago, we literally had people winning Nobel Prizes for treating people with sunlight. In my opinion, this is probably one of the most harmful dogmas that have come to be over the years. And we have to kind of really come to reconcile that. So when it comes to UV light, like, obviously we have the electromagnetic spectrum, but within the entire electromagnetic spectrum, we have a smaller segment, which we call the visible light spectrum, if you will, or the solar radiation spectrum. Let's go with that. So the solar radiation spectrum is going to include visible light, but also ultraviolet radiation and infrared on either side, right? So on the red side, the longer wavelength side, you have infrared. On the shorter wavelength side, higher frequency side, beyond violet, you're going to have ultraviolet. That's why they're named that. So UV, let's talk on the UV side of things. So shorter wavelength, higher frequency. That's, try to think of it that way. And if you need a graph, feel free to pull one up. Generally, UV rays are broken up into three categories. You have UVA, UVB, UVC. UVA are the longest wavelengths, UVB are the middle, UVC are the shortest wavelengths. And generally speaking, the rule is The shorter the wavelength, the harder it is for something to penetrate a surface. So this is why when you see certain cell towers go up in this new 5G frequency, um, they need to have more panels because the wavelengths are shorter, so they have trouble penetrating things. So that's why there need to be more in shorter distances. Longer wavelengths can go through more surfaces. So like when you actually feel the heat from the sun, that's not UV, that's usually infrared, because UV infrared longer wavelength can penetrate the skin further. So and we also know that UV radiation is not uniform throughout the day, right? So we actually have a UV index. This is how we measure it. And usually between, depending on where you are, the hours of 10 and 2 p.m. ish is when the UV index is the highest. So that's when the most UV is going to get through. Now, not all UV gets through at all times. The ozone layer, as we just talked about, filters a lot of this out. So in the ozone layer, all the UVC gets filtered out, and most of the UVB actually gets filtered out. Now, UVB is what they will tell you it causes these issues. But what gets through are the UVA and some of the UVB. And actually, there are a lot of benefits to UV light. So again, improve heart function, believe it or not, blood pressure, resting heart rate, cholesterol, um, glycogen stores, so balancing blood sugar, enhancing energy, improve sex hormone production, stimulate thyroid hormone production, which is a big thing. So sun, especially in the middle of the day, would be fantastic for these folks. Boosting metabolism, aids in the production of vitamin C, which is actually a hormone. It's not a vitamin, even though we're not going to change the name of it. What else? Oxygen capacity, boosting oxygen capacity, so you get more oxygen to more places where you need to be. And you can really maximize these benefits, when we have this full spectrum of light exposure. And we actually have these self-regulating mechanisms to know when it's too much. So, and we actually we actually end up blunting these when we use things like sunscreen. So you would, how do I explain this? If you were to say go out in the sun and you haven't been out in the sun for months, you chances are would probably get more sunburn quickly. And that's going to depend a little bit on your skin tone. So for fairer skinned people, that might be 20 minutes in the middle of the day, 30 minutes in the middle of the day, an hour. Depends. There's no rhyme or reason. Darker skin is going to take a little bit longer. That is the body telling you, okay, we've had enough for today. Let's taper it back. When you put sunscreen on, you're artificially blunting those messages. And they don't necessarily all work like sunscreen. That's a little bit of a misnomer. Like it doesn't necessarily reflect everything off. That's not really how they work. All of them work. And that assumes, obviously, that these are clean, i.e. they're not going to cause any of their own issues. What we need to realize is that the sun is only is to cause damage. It can only cause damage if you, the individual, are not ready to handle it. So, and we have this weird tendency in modern days to defer to the natural things causing you problems is the reason for our problems, but we're not looking at the unnatural things that have become normalized, I should say, in modern human society, like medication use, junk food, heavy metal exposure, stimulants like caffeine or alcohol, antibiotics, pesticides, irregular sleep, no contact with the ground with your feet, using rubber shoes, stress, non-native EMF exposure, as we were just talking about, artificial lighting, which is a whole separate problem that we're going to cover probably next week because it's too much. Certain medical procedures that are going to put more toxins in your body. Like, we don't blame that. We blame the thing that gives everything else life on the planet. Like, can you see how backwards this logic is? It's not like what we're putting on our skin. It's not what we're eating. It's like No one else, no other species is struggling with this problem except human beings. So we need to like take a step back and realize maybe it's what we're doing to ourselves that's causing the problem. Now, a big part of it's going to be what you eat. And the most protective things for your body are going to be getting the antioxidants you need. Primarily, those are going to come from fruits and vegetables. I really don't care where you start. I would prefer more colors, ideally, but start with what you like. And here's the deal: over 90% of Americans actually don't even eat the RDA recommend or the RDA recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables per day. And mind you, even 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, which is a very low amount, is associated with lower all-cause mortality. So what's happening is in mitochondria, you actually create free radicals just as part of the process. And what antioxidants do is help donate electrons to neutralize them. So there's this balance between acids and bases. This is chemistry, physics, kind of basic stuff. And we know this isn't this is an issue. So actually, there was a study at Baylor that came out, and these researchers took 2 different groups of animals, interestingly, not humans, and they put one group of the animals on a standard American diet and the other on more nutritious, nutrient dense foods, which again, 90+% of Americans don't even consume the recommended amounts of. And then they expose these animals to an amount of sun that we are told causes cancer. So I would love to know, like, would you have any guesses as to like how this study turned out? Did they both get the same amount of skin cancer? Did they not? So turns out the result was a quarter, 25% of the standard American diet group of animals, 25% of them ended up with skin cancer. Would you like to guess how many animals in the nutrient dense food group ended up with skin cancer? What percentage? Say if 25%, were eating standard American foods. It was 0, none. So again, and this is just covering one aspect, which is what we put in our mouths every day. And to not put that together, that what we eat, what we do, how we tend our own terrain affects how we interact with our environment, we're going to have a lot of problems. If the terrain is toxic, inflamed, acidic, it's going to cause problems. We know since 1970, right? We saw a big shift between like 1960 to 80, and then from 1980 essentially to now. But in 1970, Americans spent about $6 billion annually on fast food. Now, if you think that sounds like a lot, that number today is over $110 billion on fast food per year. And to put that in perspective, we spend more money, Americans spend more money on fast food than things like higher education, than personal computers, believe it or not. And I was kind of stunned when I saw that. Cars and computer software. So to pretend when you hear these topics like, oh, like it is the sun's fault, we have to really take a step back and realize, is it just the environment? Like, what are we doing to ourselves? Why are no other species on this planet ending up with skin cancers except the ones that we expose to in studies using the same garbage that we use, or domesticated animals? But the only animals that get sick are the ones that ironically are domesticated by humans. This thing does not happen in nature. What we have done is created an environment that is so detached from nature that we can't handle going into our natural environment. So we need to start looking at this a little bit differently. We need to start looking internally at the foods we eat. We need to start going back to where we came from. We need to start going back, just relearning things that people knew for thousands of years, and start reconnecting with that. Because if we keep perpetuating these lies and pretend things are bad that aren't, and not even, we didn't even touch on it. Unfortunately, I don't have time today, but if you check out the article, I do go into some of it on some of the toxic chemicals and things that go into sunscreens. It's wild. But I'm going to save that for the newsletter because I just have some things I have to prepare for right now. But we have to start reconnecting with where we came from, and we have to make it a daily thing. And this is something that, needs to be part of our daily routine. So, you know, if you're not in there in the sun regularly, like start with a few minutes each day, ideally in, the morning, midday, and afternoon. Ideally, you don't want to wear glasses or contact lenses or sunglasses. It does not count if you're sitting in your car and have the windshield and have a windshield or windows up. So you have to have exposure. You have to have your eyes exposed to the sun because, believe it or not, that's going to help as well. If you live in a really dark area, certain times of the year, you could try things like a 10,000 plus lux lamp. Um, you could try that as well in the morning. And ideally, and we'll get into this more next week, but you want to start, doing this stuff daily, and you build up over time like anything else. And of course, address what you were eating, like we're talking about. So, and if you want to get started with some of the stuff that, what you can eat, what are the things that are going to be best for humans, you could check out my ebook where I talk about that. The link is in my bio. You can check out the book if you haven't yet. If you want to dive deeper into how to put these things together in a life that makes the most sense for you, you could check out my webinar. You could sign up, the links in my bio. Or you could check out the newsletter where I'm going to talk about this stuff in more detail tomorrow. So, and the first few are out. They're on my website. You could read the first three. There's going to be a few parts that come out on Sunlight the next couple of weeks. And again, it's all there to educate and to help you guys. So, yeah, hope you guys have a good day. I'll put this up on YouTube later. Thank you for hanging out with me. See you next time.